Hello,
Okay, hello.
this is Sam. I'm here with Julian. We're laughing because our first attempt to start this conversation failed because of some problems with my VPN. But Julian, if you don't mind, could you introduce yourself, and then we can sort of leap back into our conversation.
Yeah, let's try this again. I thought my first introduction went well, so
I thought so too.
So I'm Julian. Maybe you guys most of you guys watching this have probably seen me around. I've been on VanderKlay a few times. I've been active on randos. You can find me in Discord. And I'm a Hutterite from Manitoba, Canada. That terribly cold place in the world.
Yeah, this time even colder than Chicago.
It is. Well, today is a warm day here. I think it's only -5 or something. So
today we were just above freezing here.
But yesterday was absolutely terrible. But Sam and I are connecting because I've been doing some reading on the Trinity, and Sam has his own reasons for being interested in the Trinity. It's kind of a bit of an interesting story how I've started to read up on the Trinity. There's a friend of mine who has this degree in theology, and he wanted to brush up on his Trinitarianism, and so he essentially told me to be his brain farm, and he gave me a whole bunch of books to read, and so now I have the perk of being able to learn about the Trinity and getting some free books, and I'm just keeping my friend updated at the same time. So it's also a great way of sort of also being able to communicate what I'm learning, so that I don't just read the books, and so that way because I have to communicate it, I'm able to get a better sense of what's going on and get it better ingrained in my mind. So it's really helpful.
Sure. And you had mentioned that in Hutterite communities growing up, you don't learn a ton of doctrine, but the emphasis is much more on right practice, and that you felt like the Trinity was around in the background of growing up, and it got mentioned sometimes, but it was never too strongly explicitly taught or explained or laid out. But it was more important to learn like how to follow Jesus and how to act and how to live that out.
And I don't think we're too unique in that. I think that's the case for most.
I think most American Protestants don't learn very much explicitly about the Trinity. It's sort of floating there in the background, and gets talked about sometimes, but often not very detailed in its explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So right before we disconnected, you were telling me a story about a Unitarian who was trying to join the Hutterite community, and what was going on with that.
I got reminded of this story when I was listening to you and Paul VanderKlay's recent conversation. But this is told to me by a Hutterite historian. Apparently, I think this was in the 16th, 15th century or so. I don't quite know. But there was someone trying to join these proto or early Hutterite communities, and it turns out this guy is a Unitarian, or he doesn't believe in the Trinity. So there's sort of this internal debate that starts out within the people in the community, like, let this guy join and get baptized. He doesn't. He sort of holds to all the right Hutterite distinctives. Right, he's a pacifist. He likes our idea of community of goods. He's on board with he's sort of opposed to infant baptism. He's got all the right stuff going for him. So do we let this guy join? And they ended up letting the guy join the community, and I think getting baptized. But as my friend was telling the story, he says, this was told in the Hutterite Chronicle, and that the guy who sort of recorded the chronicle then sort of added. But it turned out that this guy was unfaithful and ended up sort of leaving the church or doing something like that. So I was just sort of thinking of your conversation Alister McGrath and his definition of heresy, and it just maybe the idea that sort of wrong beliefs lead to wrong practices, and that's sort of what got the community sort of outraged at this guy, was not so much that he wasn't a Trinitarian, though of course they were skeptical about that, but they ended up he ended up falling out with the church because of some stuff he did. I don't know what the details were there, but it was interesting. This sort of as this guy was telling this story, he had at the end he had this little sentence where he said, "Oh, but he turned out not to be faithful anyway." So it was interesting.
On the train home from work today, I listened to Ryan Reeves. Do you know who Ryan Reeves is? He has a YouTube channel about church history.
I saw that on the Discord. Yeah.
Yeah, he's I like his YouTube channel a lot for the most part. And he had a video entitled "What Unitarians, Anabaptists, and Quakers" or something like that.
I think it was Baptists, but yeah.
Yes. And so I mean, I had known some of this before, but that video reminded me that Hutterites, Anabaptists, and Unitarians have some deep history in common. In that we were both considered the radical end of the Reformation. Right? And by normal Protestants, the Protestants who had gone too far. You like the mainstream Protestants, like the Calvinists, are like, oh, but we're not like those radical Reformation people. Those people sharing all their goods in common and not believing in the Trinity. Those they took our ideas to the extreme. That's not us.
It's hilarious.
And so I thought that was interesting, that you and I are in some sense still living descendants of the radical end of the Reformation, even though that meant pretty different things. Your branch was more radical in its practice, and my branch is more radical in its theology.
Yeah. I think that the Hutterites, like many of the early Anabaptists, were just all over the place with everything. Like there were sort of pacifists and non-pacifists, and Trinitarians and non-Trinitarians, and it was just a brutal mixed bag. But I think the early Hutterites were actually pretty orthodox in their beliefs, but it just wasn't as emphasized. It wasn't, and it wasn't like we ever sort of developed any kind of systematic theology. Partly because we've never really, a lot of the Hutterite history is just them sort of running around trying not to get killed. So it's only been a few hundred years
too. Unitarians also had to trot all over the globe to figure out where they wouldn't get killed. And I think both of us figured out North America was probably the right place to go.
So that's interesting.
It is funny. And that video also talked about, like, one of the connections was primitivism, which Ryan Reeves defined as, wanting to be like the early church, right? Like sort of the early church got it right, and we need to look back to them, and that traditions that develop contrary to the early church are to be viewed with suspicion, right? And so and I would say, I know among the biblical Unitarians I'm in touch with, a fair amount of them gravitate towards pacifism for that similar sort of reason. It's not uncommon. It's not generally central to the self-identity of biblical Unitarians, but you see a lot more of it, I would say, among them than among regular evangelicals. Although I haven't seen any of them start to share their goods in common.
There's not too many of those. I suppose absolutely key. I would guess this is one of the most foundational beliefs for most Unitarians would be Sola Scriptura. I would guess that would have to be pretty much at the core of what they at the core, I would suppose.
Right. It's even more core than the Unitarianism itself. Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, could you be you couldn't really be a Unitarian if you weren't Sola Scriptura.
Well, what's interesting is that most people who have heard of Unitarians have heard of Unitarian Universalists, which is sort of like the most liberal and progressive denomination that there is. And they have, I think, long since abandoned the Bible as an authority in any way whatsoever. So there were some Unitarians. I would say there was like two motivations for Unitarianism early on. One was Sola Scriptura, and like, hey, I don't think this is this Trinity thing's in the Bible.
Yeah,
maybe it's teaching something else. And then there was sort of the more rationalist Enlightenment sort of version, which started to not believe in miracles pretty quickly and stuff like that. And then pretty much like, well, Jesus is just a teacher, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore he's not the incarnation of the God or something. And so God is just one thing up there and Jesus isn't that. And so those two things were kind of together early on, although you can see Unitarians kind of leaning one direction or the other. I
think that makes sense because I think in sort of the early, the sort of liberal theology that started to develop in Germany, one of the doctrines that was early on to go was actually the Trinity, because it was just such a weird thing. Like, why do we have to have 30 persons? And so I'm not sure which theologian this was. Was it? I don't think it was Schleiermacher, Boltmann. One of them had sort of the Trinity as sort of this appendix to his systematic theology, all the way at the end. Yeah. And then Barth comes along and he puts it right at the beginning again, and that's sort of just sort of the neo-orthodox push against it. Yeah. Interesting stuff.
Because people like John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and them were Unitarians, but they were very much seemingly motivated out of that second sort of camp, the rationalistic, we don't need these superstitious old Catholic stuff anymore. We are smart enough to outthink that, and the Trinity was on that list of things. Whereas there always was sort of a contingent of the Unitarians who were like, no, we still believe in the Bible, we still believe in miracles, and we still believe that Jesus is the Messiah in some sense, but we just don't think the Bible teaches the Trinitarian understanding of those things.
Yeah.
So, and although that second camp, which I would say I belong to, is certainly the minority of Unitarians, and Unitarians themselves are a minority. So the minority within the minority. But the strange thing is that we look pretty similar to evangelicals nowadays, except for this this main doctrine. So I guess what books did you read in this sort of deep venture into the Trinity with your friends, and what's that been making you think about?
I've only read 2 books so far. The first one I read, which I really enjoyed, was Michael Reeves' Delighting in the Trinity, which was a short little book. And what do I say about that one? Yeah, that's the first one I read. And then the second one I read most recently was Fred Sanders' The Deep Things of God, which was a bit of a more stuffy read. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but I did learn a lot from it. So you mentioned you started that book, but you didn't finish it. I wonder why that was.
So part of
just a second. He also said you once had this argument with this conversation with Fred Sanders. I'd love to hear about how that went as well, because
sure. So part of
did those two things overlap?
Right. So if you've seen the first conversation that I had with VanderKlay, I tell the story about my excommunication that happened still less than a year ago, where I had been going to a regular evangelical Trinitarian Bible sort of church, and had been there for a year, was in a Bible study, and then I wanted to join the worship band, and then that led to me having to talk to the pastor about my beliefs, and that led to my non-Trinitarianism being an issue. So while that was happening, lo and behold, we had a guest person come in and preach a 3-sermon series at our church, and that person was Fred Sanders.
Is that a coincidence, or did they know they had Unitarians in their midst?
I think it was a coincidence, although whether it was a coincidence in God's providence, who knows? So after they decide to excommunicate me, I have one more meeting with the pastor where I was like kind of wanting to dispute this. And so his roommate from seminary was Fred Sanders, or if not a roommate, at least a good friend. And so Fred Sanders, I think, normally lives in California, but he was in Illinois for that semester because he was doing some sort of, I don't know, adjunct professorship or something at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is in the Chicago area. And so he was in my neck of the woods. So he gets called. So it's the pastor, Fred Sanders, and me. And I'm trying to basically appeal my excommunication. And the expert witness called against me is none other than Fred Sanders.
Oh, boy. Yeah, that's heavy hitting.
So we met at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is an ironic place to have this discussion. Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is sort of like the main or maybe the flagship divinity school for evangelical pastors. And of course, it's named Trinity. When I told my dad that was going to happen, he's like, well, that sounds like an away game, not a home game, to have that discussion. So it was only about an hour. And my main goal was to be like, so Fred, there's the doctrine of the Trinity, and there isn't a hope and a prayer that I'm going to change your mind on that in this meeting with you face to face. But why do you think that this is an essential doctrine in order to be saved or to be considered a member of the church? Because it's one thing to say that a doctrine is true, but it's another thing to say that it's required and that it's required for salvation and stuff like that. So how do you think about you, Fred Sanders, it being deserving of that extra status, right? And to be honest, this discussion was a little bit more, it devolved into more of a debate than a discussion than I would have liked. But I will have to say, considering that it kind of turned into more of a debate than a good-natured discussion, considering it was me, some random layperson, versus the expert on the Trinity in all of American evangelicalism, I would say I didn't get destroyed, and I thought I brought up some pretty good points to him and made him think a little bit, and was surprised that he didn't just like blow me over or something like that. I don't mean to toot my own horn too much, but then after an hour, it was like, oh, I've got to go pick up my kids from soccer practice or whatever. And then he just kind of left and that was it. And I was still excommunicated. So that was my interaction with Fred. And I wouldn't say it was a very positive one. And I'm not sure how much he really cared for hearing what I had to say. But so that was my interaction. So I read, or I didn't read all of it. I read 2/3 of Deep Things of God in preparation for that meeting with him, as well as listening to a lot of his YouTube videos and stuff like that to understand where he was coming from and to get a sense of what sort of person he was. So,
I mean, just reading the Deep Things of God, it doesn't sound like the type of person who would be fun to debate with, because he seems like a very, I don't know, he just seemed like a very self-certain type of person or something. If you know what, I don't know, did you get the sense from reading the book?
I got the sense from reading the book and from interacting with him in person that he was quite smugly content in his ideas and viewed himself as somewhat superior to the average, I don't know, lay person in the pew.
Yeah.
And that was a little off-putting, if I'm honest.
Yeah, that was one thing that sort of put me off from the book was, just sort of a lot of the sort of one-line dismissals he had of different, just when he has this one-line dismissal of Karl Barth or whatever, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose evangelicals aren't too big a fan. Have their quarrels with Karl Barth, but like at one point he quotes this guy who says do you know Packer? Who's he's apparently a Reformed theologian or something. Something Packer. But they were talking about Packer's views in Scripture, and he said, and this guy says, Packer has all that Karl Barth ever dreamed of without dismissing the Orthodox view of Scripture. And I'm like, that's just not a very. It's just a stupid thing to say, because for one, Karl Barth, like, who is this other guy, and you're comparing him to Karl Barth, not to mention the fact that Karl Barth is coming from the middle of German liberalism and is just charting a new course in the midst of that whole stream of thinking, standing up to the Third Reich. It's like it's just unfair to dismiss him like that. So yeah, it was sort of, I found a few of those types of things that sort of annoyed me, and I would say the whole tone was sort of just sort of narrow in some way. It just felt like there wasn't a whole lot of room to breathe in his way of thinking about the Trinity. I don't know.
Sure.
That could partly be just my temperament also.
So to kind of, I don't know, to sort of make one of his points for him and then maybe talk against it a little bit. Like, his big thing is it also seemed like he was writing it for both regular evangelicals and for his non-evangelical theologian peers, right? Those seem to be like his two audiences. Okay. And for the non-evangelical theologian peers, it seems like you could almost read in between the lines that he gets criticized that evangelicals aren't very Trinitarian, right? And that sort of relates to what we were saying earlier, that a lot of American Protestants don't grow up being taught very much about the Trinity. And so, but he's like, actually, because evangelicals act out their faith better than you other non-evangelical people out there, we're actually more Trinitarian because we act it out, and the gospel's Trinitarian. And so if you're acting out the gospel, then you're Trinitarian. And so take that.
That I was just annoyed also by the whole, by just how evangelical the book was. Like at the beginning, he says, evangelicals emphasize the cross, conversion, personal relationship, and heaven. And then he says, it's completely right to emphasize those four things because that's the essence of Christianity. Right. And then he just quotes all of these evangelical thinkers, all of these pietists, and boy, pietists are not my cup of tea. I just don't enjoy reading them at all. It's like every sentence they write is sort of filled with this sense of how amazing and grand and awesome God is, but it always seems to me like it has sort of a gun pointed at your head at the same time, where it's like, if you don't find this amazing, you're not a real Christian. That's sort of how the pietists come across to me. Do you get that sense? It's like, you must find this amazing the way I'm describing it, or you don't have this proper relationship with Jesus. And whatever.
Yeah, you need to be happy and enlightened like me, or else faith must not be working inside you. And that has a hard time dealing with, what if you have periods of spiritual drought or doubts or things like that? And,
for sure.
And how does that connect? Because most Christians will experience stuff like that at points in their lives. Yeah. I think it's interesting. Like, you, me, and Paul VanderKlay are all sort of like on the periphery of evangelicalism, right? Like, we can see evangelicalism and understand it. And sometimes we maybe even like participate in it. But by certain things, by certain standards, by certain definitions, we're not exactly evangelical itself, right?
I do tend to think at least the language Hutterites use isn't evangelical at all, right?
Right.
The very pietistic language way of expressing their faith that evangelicals have is very foreign to most Hutterites. So if you sort of have this language of being born again, having a personal relationship, and all of the kind of things that come along with that. That's sort of not how Hutterites. That's just not the language Hutterites use to express their faith. And
sure. What is the language Hutterites use?
It's a lot more of this. I guess we'd have our own traditional categories, like we'd use German words to some degree. It's a bit of a interesting in-house thing where you'll have Hutterites who've been exposed more to evangelical authors, evangelical thinkers, and they'll start to adopt this kind of language, and they'll say, I have this personal relationship, and then it'll sort of butt heads with the sort of traditional Hutterites who sort of have this different language. So that's an interesting dynamic. I don't know. Does that ring true to any sort of church experience you have, or?
Yeah, and my church was probably closer to evangelicalism and more directly influenced by it than yours, and that we were all about personal relationships with Jesus. That was just honky dory. That was the idea.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Like here's one thing that'll explain this in a really funny way for a lot of. So in Reformed circles, the cardinal sin is works righteousness, right? In Anabaptist Hutterite circles, the cardinal sin is the reverse of that. It's being once saved, always saved, and assuming you don't have to do anything. You don't have to follow
taking
Jesus.
Your salvation for granted or something like that.
Exactly. That's the cardinal sin for traditional Hutterites. So it's like you'll have it's absolutely hilarious that you'll have Reformed or evangelical circles going on and on about works righteousness, and at the same time in our circles there's the literal opposite sort of cardinal sin that's being emphasized.
That is funny. That's the cardinal sin of my group would be not being biblical, right? Oh, that's not a biblical idea. That's not a biblical teaching. What verse are you getting that idea from, right? That is our cardinal sin.
Yeah. There's some of that, but I don't think it's quite to the extreme you see in other traditions, for sure.
Yeah. It's funny. You can tell what a group cares about by what their cardinal sin is. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's true. Yeah, it's like, for the Reformed or the I don't know these traditions too well, but it's something like grace is what's essential.
Yeah.
For different traditions, it's all about the Bible, and for Anabaptists, it's all about following Jesus. I wonder what the Catholic cardinal sin is.
Well, they actually have a list of them, don't they? I think. Right? I don't know all of them, but they've enumerated exactly what the cardinal sins are. But their actions, right? I suppose that's what's different about what Catholicism, like divorce, I think. Correct me at Catholics if I'm wrong, but that would be one of the cardinal sins, and a couple other things like that. And then you have to go through some extra amount of penance or whatever to get back in right relationship with the church and God if you've committed a cardinal sin. So it's a complicated. Even divorce in Catholic circles is also a complicated topic with types of stuff that's going on with Pope Francis. He wants to move towards under certain circumstances readmitting divorced and remarried Catholics into community. That's just started a bit of a debate among conservative and liberal, or whatever the categories you want to. So they've got their own in-house. You see the Catholics on the Discord server discussing those sorts of things. So let's see here. I guess kind of picking back the thread up with Fred Sanders.
I would have a good jumping off point for the Sanders book if you don't have anything else. But
go for it.
I think one interesting aspect, and this is probably close to the central part of his book, is his discussion of tact, knowing, and I think that's what allows him to make the claim that evangelicals are the most Trinitarian ever. Like he doesn't pull his punches. He says they're the most Trinitarian.
So go into more detail about what you think he means by tacit belief.
Oh, tacit. Okay, so he gets this from Michael Polanyi, and essentially what he's getting at is, it's just he used the word presuppositions. That's almost what he's getting at, but it's sort of, I would guess, I think it's a level before presuppositions. It's sort of the precognitive stance you have, which then allows you to know which beliefs you're supposed to hold. So think about, you actually articulated this well in your conversation with Paul when you said, the Unitarians have one way of reading Scripture and the other, the Trinitarians have another way, and it all comes down to presuppositions. And I think that's about what he's saying. But I wouldn't use the word presuppositions. I'd say the Trinitarians have a different framework. They have a different lenses is almost right, but they have a different way of attending to Scripture. And they're just coming at it with this different. They've been formed in a different way so that different things pop out to them. So just think about how all of the Christian different. We were just talking about the differences between evangelicals and Anabaptists and Reformed or what have you. Just the way we've been formed in our culture, in our liturgy, in the conversations we have, this sort of creates this underlying structure, this tact way of attending, framework, lenses, whatever you want to use, precognitive, not exactly a belief, but this just then makes you put the world together in a certain way. And so I think what Sanders is claiming is that evangelicals sort of presuppose the Trinity in the things they emphasize. So they emphasize he says they emphasize, personal Scripture reading, conversion, personal relationship with Jesus. There was one other one, I think. Oh, and personal prayer. And his whole argument in the book is that all of these are sort of only make sense from a Trinitarian perspective and sort of presuppose the Trinity. I don't know
So it's sort of like in Jordan Peterson's speak, you believe you act out what you believe, and what you believe is what's sort of, informed by your actions. Sort of like this idea that there are beliefs that you could maybe even not know at the level of proposition, but it's deeper down in you.
There's this quote from Polanyi that where it says, you always believe more than you know.
Right. And Jordan Peterson will say almost the exact same thing.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. And so
there's another, can I emphasize one more thing? Polanyi also says we need to get rid of this idea that we can this is essentially what's behind the debate between Peterson and Harris, right? We need to get rid of the idea that we can just approach the world objectively and sort of gather the data we need.
Right.
What Polanyi says is we need to recognize that we have these prior faith commitments, these prior beliefs, which come before our coming to the world, and even something like science, right? We think science is just me objectively looking at the world, but what's actually going on and this isn't really to diminish science in any way. This is just the way it is what a scientist is a trained person who's been trained to attend to the world in a certain way, to have these practices. In other words, to come to the world with these ways of attending and with these beliefs, which then make him see the world in the way science wants to see the world, and to come to get the benefits that brings with it.
Right. And so I think this is super related to the topic of the Trinity, because I think too many people think that you can go to the Bible and read it and all of its teachings are obvious. And that one thing that I've experienced, because I've had a lot of ranging from discussions to talks to debates about the Trinity, and especially about, scriptural evidence, yea or nay, for the Trinity. And it never ceases to amaze me what seems obvious to some people is completely not obvious to others, and vice versa, right? Like, I've had so many times where I'll bring up a Bible verse, I'm like, look, this clearly shows that the Trinity is not right. And they're like, what? What do you mean? I just understand the Bible verse this way. And then they'll do the same thing to me, like, therefore you should go and baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Boom, the Trinity. I'm like, it doesn't mention the Trinity anywhere in there. It doesn't say what substance they're made out of or any of those sorts. And it's amazing, how much people bring to the text that is shaping the way that they understand it. And I think that a lot of this debate between Unitarians and Trinitarians is hard to flesh out, because a lot of it is at the level of these presuppositions and interpretation rules and ideas and mechanisms that shape how you read the Bible itself. And so when each side is going at each other, I'm more biblical than you are, I'm more biblical than you are, they're not even like speaking the same definition of biblical, really, is really part of the weird thing, because their presuppositions and their reading, habits and their interpretive mechanism cause them to see different things, even though they're both trying to trust in the Bible for what it is that they should read from their interpretive mechanism, right?
So you're almost saying the whole argument over whether something is biblical or not is almost a futile debate, because
I don't mean to go that far. Like, there's something I still think the Bible's teaching something. And also, if like you and I were to have the same interpretive lens, then theoretically we could have a good discussion and then come to an agreement about what it's saying. Although how much two people can ever share that is difficult. But I think that, like, within a tradition, right? Like, you've been shaped in Hutterite communities, and I've been shaped in my own communities. Like, within a community, people learn the same habits of how to interpret the Bible, and so it's easier for them to come to an agreement, right? Because not only are they seeing the Bible the same way, but then they can talk about it the same way and make arguments about what it's saying and what it isn't. So I don't mean to just devolve into pure subjectivity and relativism or something.
I think it is a bit too quick of a leap to go from. I've noticed a lot of on this channel we talk a lot about Sola Scriptura and should we really all be Catholics and this type of thing. And I think it's sort of it's too often an abstract problem, right? Where we'll say, you can look at all of these different people coming to these different conclusions. Doesn't that mean the Bible doesn't clearly teach this or that? And I wonder if we actually went into the weeds on specific topics, if things would be a bit. I just think that the jump to Sola Scriptura is just stupid is maybe a bit too quick of a leap to make. But then again, I guess the whole issue of biblical interpretation is also tied up with all kinds of other questions. right? So let's say you can reach the proper conclusion about what the Bible is saying. How does that translate into our current context today? And there's all kinds of questions that have to be answered between me getting the right interpretation and then me applying it in my everyday. I think there's still some other questions you have to at least get an opinion on before.
Right, because you could be a secular scholar like Bart Ehrman, who's equally concerned about trying to understand what it is that the Bible said, right?
Yeah.
But he's not trying to apply it in his life the same way an evangelical Bible scholar is trying to, right? Or the way a lay person reading the Bible for themselves is.
And think about what your view is about what the Bible is, right? We can go into the Old Testament and find out exactly what Chronicles is teaching us, but does that mean it has any claim to guide our moral decisions today, right? You have to figure out, is the Bible, is it a narrative? Is it God? Is every word sort of directly? Is it sort of this flat plane that I can just take a verse from here and then directly apply it? Or there's all kinds of different views here. Yeah.
Right. Or is the way the first century church behaved in the book of Acts something that we're supposed to emulate? Or is that something that's just in there for descriptive purposes, right? Yeah. And that's where you and I are on, or our traditions are on the same side of, that is telling us what we're supposed to do. And other Protestants are like, no, that's just saying what they did do, right?
Yeah.
And how do you decide that dispute? Right.
And another question I also keep coming back to is, if you look at the way the early church is engaging with the culture, if you think about someone like the Apostle Paul, drawing on Greek philosophy and Jewish categories, and talking to all kinds of people, you have to ask. So what does that say about how Christians are supposed to engage with, contemporary philosophy, contemporary concerns? And this raises a second question of, is how the early church engages with culture sort of normative for how we engage with culture, right? Are we supposed to, have this very antagonistic view? It's us in the world. This is obviously very sort of the position Hutterites have taken. It's sort of, there's this clear delineation between the church and the world. But how is each era supposed to have its own engagement with culture, or on these first century ways of engaging? Yeah.
Sure, I can imagine how that's a much more important and pressing question for you. I suppose, I'm not sure. We kind of talked about it, but not like a ton.
Isn't that also, though, a sort of a mainstream evangelical concern too?
Yeah,
in a way,
I guess so. Like going to movies.
Where like or like you aren't really supposed to engage with those philosophers or this type.
Right.
Christians always have this tension between the world and Christian. Yeah, it's obviously a lot more extreme with a group like the Hutterites, but yeah.
Right, like a big thread of biblical Unitarianism is that it is skeptical of the influence of Greek philosophy in the early church, right? Okay. Like we would, a quick simplistic version of the narrative is like, Christianity started out as Jewish, and those Jews were Unitarians, and the Jews didn't think that Jesus was God. And then it got mixed up with Greek philosophy, especially Neoplatonism, in places like Alexandria and Turkey and Constantinople and stuff like that. And that the Trinity is sort of like this unholy marriage of Neoplatonic Greek philosophy and biblical teaching, and that it got away from the early church and what the apostles believed, because it got too in bed with worldly philosophies and ideas and stuff like that. And one can certainly show that there's a lot of historical truth to the fact that the Trinity is very informed by Neoplatonic categories and stuff like that. But one could say, well, that was a good thing, right? Alister McGrath, in his book that I read, he fully acknowledges that. And then he's like, but yeah, and that's what it had to do to engage with the culture and to communicate to the educated, learned people of the time. And Greek philosophy has a lot of good things in it, and that was a compliment to the church, right? So same story. I'm sure Alister McGrath and I could be like, yeah, here's how the doctrine of the Trinity developed, and here's how that's related to Greek philosophy. And I would be like, and that's why it's wrong. And he'd be like, oh no, that's why it's right, right? And so, how do you make a determination between those 2 points of view? It's weird.
Well, I don't know if the Trinity is sort of just hatched out of Greek categories. I think it's more like these. Yeah, it depends also what your perspective is on first century. On Second Temple Judaism. Like, is this just completely Jewish thing, or has it already been influenced by Greek categories? If you get into someone like the Apostle Paul, he's quoting Greek philosophers. So what do you do with that? Just rip it out of your New Testament?
Right. The Greek influence is there from the get-go, although it does seem like the Trinitarian doctrinal development. Although the funny thing is that it's just as true as the Arians too. The Arians and the Trinitarians were very influenced by Greek philosophy. And it's the biblical Unitarians they're trying to say, oh, we're not like the Arians or the Trinitarians.
And so the Bible Project has this really good, I wonder if the episodes on God, did you see that one?
Yes, that's where he does like the 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional thing where there's this 3-dimensional shape interacting with like the 2-dimensional plane.
Oh, that's just the video. They have like a 20-part podcast on God.
A 20-part podcast. I have not listened to that. No.
You would be interested. Like, they really dig into the Jewish Old Testament. I can run you through that a bit if you're interested.
Sure, go for it.
Because you'd probably appreciate this because you're obviously someone who's, as a biblical Unitarian, you're really interested in what the Bible has to say. So they sort of make the argument that already within the Old Testament, you have this portrait of God who's sort of complex. He has these attributes such as wisdom would be one example, which are in some sense God, but in some sense distinct from God. And then you have instances like the burning bush, where the burning bush is God, but it's distinct from God, or the angel of the Lord is God, but it's distinct from God. So you have this complex portrait of God where he's complex. It's not quite. They would argue it's not quite as simple as just monotheism. There's something else going on there in the portrait. And then you have the category of the Son of Man from Daniel, where this gets complicated. Where the Son of Man is this exalted human figure, exalted to the throne of the throne next to the Ancient of Days, and when Jesus comes along, he starts to declare that he is the Son of Man. And apparently, this people often sort of, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of God and the Son of Man, and people often think, the Son of God is the more godly way of describing himself. But they think, he called himself the Son of God. That must mean he's saying he's God. But they actually make the claim that it's actually the Son of Man category that's more exalted, because Oh man, I'm pretty.
Because he comes on the clouds of heaven.
Yeah, well, he's exalted to the right hand of God.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, I have some notes here. Just a second. Are you tracking with this at all, or is this all new stuff to you? Without it,
there's a little bit of both. Keep going.
Okay, here it is. I guess part of what's going on with the Son of Man is that it's also connected to this idea of humans made in the image of God. Where part of what the image of God is it's a vocation, where humans are called to be the divine image bearers in God's creation. And so what you see in the fall is humans, failing that vocation, essentially. And then you have these biblical figures like Moses, David, and others who sort of come very close to fulfilling this divine image and representing
like
God.
God even says that I will make you God to Pharaoh, to Moses, right?
Exactly. Yeah. They actually make the claim that there's the similar dynamic going on with these figures like Moses, especially, where he's so closely identified with God that it's often hard to know what God is doing and what Moses is doing.
Right.
And then Moses, with the Sinai story, where Moses enters in, God says he's going to destroy the people, but then Moses stops him. Like, he reasons with God. It sort of enters into the divine dialogue. You can just see the Trinitarian stuff going on. Well, me reading Trinitarian stuff maybe into this, but Moses sort of entering into the divine dialogue and calling off the destruction. And then, Moses' face starts to glow. So Moses is probably the figure in the Old Testament that comes closest to being the image of God, but he also falls short. And this is where you get the category of the Son of Man, which is this exalted human exalted up to the right hand of God. So this is a human being who, oh man, this is complicated.
This is complicated, yeah. And David gets called God a couple times too, which is weird. Or the Davidic king will get called God. Your throne, O God, lasts forever. Therefore, God, your God, has highly exalted you. Right. So it's like,
the Lord said to my Lord. Is that another one that comes to mind? Yeah.
Yeah. And then also the judges get called God. Right, Jesus quotes that passage in John chapter 10, right? He says, it was okay for the judges back in those days, those to whom the word of God came were called gods, right? So there's this weird sense in which the word God can sometimes be applied to humans in a way that is apparently not blasphemous, but but I don't think it's like. It's not like it's not like saying Moses joined the Trinity or something like that, or that King David is consubstantial with the Father or something like that. But it's like there's some unique sense in which they, at least at that time, are specially embodying what God is doing, or God is working through them in some kind of special and unique sense.
Yeah. What was I going to say? I don't know. I could.
Son of Man, David or Daniel.
Yeah.